Welcome to Flow Party number 52. We are exploring Mast with a friend, Corey. Corey is a friend of Flow Party. He's been here a few times, and we're glad to have him back. Today we're going to go through No-Code Supply Company's Mast framework for Webflow. Mast is a lightweight developer-first framework of essential classes and strategies to help you build efficiently for any brand at pretty much any scale inside of Webflow. And we're excited about today's session. So if you have questions, drop them in chat, and I'm going to hand it over to Corey, and we'll just get the ball rolling.
Sweet.
Yes.
What's up, y'all? Stoked to be here. I have a little presentation, multimedia presentation. I'll go through more just to set the stage of frameworks, not necessarily just Mast. Because at the end of the day, like, I'll start by saying our biggest goal with Mast is not just that it's the king and used by all. It's more just like there's many options out there and there's lots of ways. And as long as you're using a framework, that's the goal, right? So I'll share my screen. Please drop comments in the chat. I'll try to be as efficient as I can going through the deck, so we have time to just play and have questions and open conversation, because it's a fun topic, right? So let me share my screen. Probably should have even done this. Hopefully I'm good. Can you all see this?
You are good.
Sweet. Sick. Cool. So Mast, thank you. Yeah, so much, Eric, for the intro. Who am I? I'm Corey. By day, I'm a staff brand designer, web at Webflow. So basically on the team that build and maintains webflow.com, or all the marketing end of it in Webflow. By evening and weekends, when I'm not with kids and family, I have two little ones and a dog. I am a self-proclaimed freelance Webflow tech lead. Been doing that for 5-6 years, and kind of going towards more that the tech lead concept of like consulting and custom stuff. And then, yeah, No Code Supply Co. is kind of a pet project of myself and Max Lind, who's also a team member at Webflow and also here in Des Moines, Iowa with me. Super exciting here. Getting hot, humid, and lots of corn. That's the TLDR of Iowa. So I'll go through why, what, and how of Mast and just frameworks at large. And then, yeah, get into a little demo, or really just like, I hope the demo can be, centered around your questions and things. So why Mast, why frameworks, right? This is going to get meta. Hang on tight. It's going to get nerdy. So at the highest level, nearly everything that is created and maintained in the world today has two things in common. There is a system and a process to it, right? Like there surely is still things that are completely scratch made in the world, but things that are built at scale across many different industries and services like websites have systems and processes, right? So from a definition standpoint, a system being a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, and then the process being a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. So if you think about like literally anything aside from just developing a website, eating sushi, driving a car, building a house is a great example that I love to compare, right? So building homes, especially, in first world countries and things, or even any range of economy, ends up having a process because, we all need to have a place to live, right? And so you can compare that to a website in that, you design it, you source materials, you build it, you inspect it, and then you maintain it. Right? In both those realms, all these steps need to happen, and it's just different people or different assets and things involved along the way to do those things. And so why do we need systems and processes, right? Like, what's the point? So efficiency would be the main one. Instead of sourcing and building everything from scratch, like let's use materials and tools that are available, and not reinvent the wheel every time. Consistency. So at scale, if we want to make something that's not only repeatable, but also yields like a high quality product that can continue to be refined, we need to have those systems and processes there to get us there. And then the other benefit is that similar to efficiency, it actually reduces human error, right? And cognitive load, because things are already predetermined. You're kind of following the list and going through it. Lastly is collaboration. So there's no I in team. Right. And so ultimately, like, we are all here today because of the culmination and sharing of knowledge and processes and systems throughout humanity. Right. Like, think all the way back to cavemen and, marking things on where to go hunt on cave walls and things like that. Communication and collaboration is literally at the essence of us evolving and growing as a society. And so as deep and nerdy and weird as that sounds, like we can apply those concepts and leverage them to advance, how we build websites even as a community, right? So this all hopefully makes sense, but modern tools like Webflow almost make it too easy to just jump right in without a system or process, right? Like for me, when I first found Webflow, coming from WordPress and other worlds like that, where I had to spend, it felt like eternity finding the perfect theme or template, and then had to like rigmarole it into what I wanted to create, and then finding something like Webflow where I could just genuinely create from scratch is both freeing and also intimidating. And intimidating from the sense of this, right? If you don't have an approach and a process, it can get, unwieldy pretty quickly, right? So thankfully, the other benefit of something like Webflow is that it's all based around HTML and CSS and the essence of those native languages on the web. And those native languages have had frameworks and tooling built around them long before Webflow was ever even in existence. So we should leverage those, right? Just like, we leverage all the knowledge of how to cut and manipulate wood to build homes that have been evolved over hundreds of years. Why would we not leverage all the knowledge from inside and outside and before or, coming in the future stuff from the community of the web and how we build on it, right? So in the middle, as an example, is a framework called Bootstrap that is a heavy influence in a lot of what Mast is today. For me, this was a CSS framework I used and learned before ever discovering Webflow. And so a lot of the principles in it I became familiar with and came to love. And then, Mast is kind of a result of some of those coming to life in Webflow, right? So after years of building different systems and processes to bring projects to life on teams large and small, as I mentioned, I've freelanced for quite a while. Before I was at Webflow, I was at a larger company as well, working on like a design team of like 30, 40 people, building for different scales. So yeah, this has all been informed over that time and iterated on in many different ways. So we launched Mast out of just finally having this point of, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of different ways to go about frameworks, and the Webflow community is so lively and active. And that's my favorite part about it, that like, sometimes there can also be really loud voices of only one way or another doing things. We're like, hey, let's just, publish Mast, even give it a name, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's how it came to be. So what is Mast? Eric kind of alluded to this. It is a lightweight developer-first framework of essential classes and strategies to help you build efficiently for any brand and scale with Webflow, right? So if we break this down, it's not intended to only be marketing say, but like very strategically try to, position the wording into what we feel it's best at. So lightweight and developer first, meaning that one of the biggest things, I have come to prefer, at least, as well as Max, in building with things like Webflow, or again, even before Webflow, is a light enough system or a approachable enough system that I'm not like overwhelmed or feel like it's impossible to remember all the different functions of it. And so lightweight, and the way that Mast is intentionally less of only the, if you think about things like the 80-20 principle, right? Like it is, intended to solve for the 80% of things out of the box, but there's always going to be that leftover 20% that is custom or needs to be added per instance of the site, right? And so this is where the developer first part comes in, is that extra 20%, is that Mast is also using multiple units and a lot of CSS strategy that you definitely need to have a developer's mindset, at least with some comfortability of HTML and CSS. And that helps, working with it much more easily. So I would say it's not necessarily like the best for just handing off to a client that knows nothing about HTML and CSS, et cetera, but sits in that middle ground, right? So essential classes and strategies, I kind of alluded to this, but the point of this is that it is less is more, is the mentality out of having just the minimal amount to get you as far as you can, and then building efficiently for any brand and scale. So efficiency is definitely another big part of this, and I would say the most efficient aspect of it we will show and hopefully chat about in the demo is the layout system, which is almost verbatim, a replica of like Bootstrap. That is a row and column system that's been evolved over years, and just makes it really, really quick to build out layouts for the majority of the site without needing to find pre-built things and that kind of stuff. And then scale, meaning, the whole framework is built with a dry mentality, which stands for do not repeat yourself. So we want to be as efficient with our CSS as possible so that not only, have a lighter weight site and a lighter weight CSS file at the end of the day for performance reasons, but the other benefit of it is you just have less to maintain, less classes that could throw things awry later on, right? So what makes it different? So less is more. As I mentioned, less classes, less elements, less maintenance equals faster development and customization. So I mentioned classes. The other concept is elements and maintenance, right? So things like if we have a section and container, let's try to keep it as few elements and as efficient as possible to leave space for things like Lottie files or other big DOM inhibiting things that may be introduced depending on the site you're building. And then again, maintenance, as I mentioned, this is even out of like having a strategy in place that I don't know if anybody has ever, jumped into a project from a client you acquired or somebody else's team, and there's like 1,000 unused classes in it, and you just need a couple columns and you don't even know where to start. You don't want to add more per se, you want to reuse, and it just becomes, a little chaotic. So we want to keep it tight and less as possible, right? So create versus copy is another mentality that I know is probably contentious in the Webflow community, especially with how vibrant the community has gotten with component libraries like Reloom, which, if I can be crystal clear, I think are still epic and very valuable. And this ethos really comes from what I noted about frustrations that I had with ways of building for the web before I started using Webflow. So things like WordPress and finding themes, or, even at one point I was like going to ThemeForest and just getting like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript templates. And I would spend days and hours finding just like the perfect thing that was general enough I could use it for anything, but specific enough that I wouldn't have to modify things so much for the specific use case, right? So the theory here is that instead of spending that time searching for the perfect component or the perfect layout or whatever that you can copy, do you have just a framework that you can efficiently build that thing in actually less time than it would take you to find something that's pre-built, right? Lastly is tried and true. So this is really out of both, again, Mast is not something Max and I just made up. It's something that, I've personally used for like 5-6 years in different companies, teams, freelance projects, and then evolved and iterated over time. And I'm still doing so. Like, honestly, get feedback all the time. That is so valuable to vet and then understand if it makes sense to evolve the platform. And then even the 10+ years is more alluding to things like Bootstrap, and a lot of the utility naming and strategies in the framework is not, it's all based on other things that have come before. And then my thought on how it can evolve and kind of be combined into one approach in Webflow, right? So what can you build with it? Really anything. That's the whole point, is that Mast is brand agnostic. So although the base style guide does have some opinionated choices in it, like it comes with a custom font that is free, by the way, and some colors and things like that, the point of Mast is that, it can accommodate any brand, and, we've used it across a bunch of different sites. If you go to the Mast landing page, you will see a Mast made section that has all these sites you see here and a couple others that are all like real client sites, most of which that were built with the studio ShapeMaker that I've worked with on the side for 3 years plus. And they're all safe. They're like duplicates of the client projects that I just cleaned up, so there's no privacy risks or whatever. And then these are all, even to be clear, pre-release versions of Mast. So before Mast even had a name, but it's still all the same essential utilities and strategy, etc. All right, lastly, how? So go to nocodesupply.co/Mast, that you will see the landing page where you can get to a button that links to the doc. And I just realized that this is the image of the pre-release docs in Notion, which they are officially on a page now. And then, yes, clone the style guide. So just like any other framework, if you're familiar with using in Webflow, the method in which you start is always a clonable that has all those predetermined styles and classes and utilities, etc. And then you can clone it, rename it for your project, and then update type styles, colors, etc. to match the brand of whatever project you're working on. So lastly, again, this is developer first. And so I think my biggest like advice, whether again, you're using Mast or any other that's in the community, is learn and practice. Like, although this is meant to be, a way that makes it faster, more efficient, and more reusable to build things, it's also not intended to be something that's just like snap your fingers out of the box and you'll get it, having to adjust at every breakpoint. And then there's just less of them. That comes back to the lightweight concept. That I personally don't think you need like such a wide range of spacing and styles. There's a lot of this like mentality, I guess, to also shift towards around that less is more concept. Like, there's a note in the docs of Mast around the typography, even that the style guide out of the box only has H1 through 4. And that's on purpose. Like, I personally think you can create like better designs and work way more efficiently with less, because you have like less need to like, oh wait, which size was that? And then even just from a design aesthetic perspective, the less options you have allows for more contrast you can have between a type scale. And so by no means does that mean you can't use H5 and H6. You could totally add them. It's just, an example out of the ethos of less is more. So I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense. I think, Devin, you asked, but please, speak up if any other clarifying I can offer on that. Yeah.
Thank you, Devin, for being the first one to ask a pretty good question there. Dan did hit us up with a different one. Dan Dawson, how does Mast address these two competing pain points in Webflow? Deep stacking classes versus exhaustive amounts of empty devs.
Yes. So the deep stacking classes, again, similar to client first, we just have guidelines or best practices in the docs that says like you shouldn't overstack classes, right? Like, you can use either extra elements to divide out utilities, or use a custom class. Like that's the other thing here, is that Mast by no means is a anti-custom class utility everything framework, which you would probably find if you've heard of like Tailwind outside of Webflow, right? Or even more recently, Lumos that Timothy Ricks is working on, which is like, honestly looks epic. But that is what I would call utility first framework. So it's intended that the 80, 90 or more % of everything you make is based on existing utilities that are combined. And that's where you do get into this use case of like having to stack a ton together. Whereas in Mast, like usually, I would rarely add more than 3 for any instance. And if I'm adding more than 3, then I would ask myself, maybe this should be a custom class because of how much I'm needing to fine tune this. Or, again, can I divide things out into different elements and achieve the same thing, right? And then empty divs, Mast is not, I'll just say I'm not a fan of using empty div spacers. I think, spacing should be applied to type or elements, etc. And so, it just doesn't follow that principle. I think, I mentioned that like margin utilities and padding utilities are M based. And the main reason for that is that, I always got frustrated with frameworks that like I'd have to add a spacing utility and then adjust a combo of it or variant of it at every breakpoint, and realized that a lot of the times I was adding spacing to like headings or things like that, where the font size is already by default going to change at every breakpoint. So M's, will change with the font size of the item itself or the element itself or its parent. So, using M's leverages a way to kind of like hijack that change that already happens with font size, but within, a utility that's applied to the text itself. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, sounds good. Does anyone else have any other questions before we get into a demo? I know there's a lot of people here who have used Mast so far as probably about 50-50 between they've used Mast and they're very interested in using Mast. And maybe we can get into a demo and kind of overcome some maybe the hurdles of just starting. That's always the hardest part, right? So.
It's just, Let me share my screen and then. And please feel free to speak up if there's any other questions along the way. So as I mentioned, actually, maybe I'll even pull up the landing page here. So again, this is where you can come access docs that are all, fully linked in here. You can share links with people by clicking this. So especially for like clients or somebody you're passing this off to, we were, excited to finally get a more official docs out here. that covers everything. And again, this is even something we're still kind of evolving the more we get feedback and use it. So I'm so grateful for anybody that ever wants to share thoughts via email or DM and Twitter, whatever. I'm open to all of it. So yeah, check out the docs. And then back on the landing page, you can clone styles. So come out here and clone the style guide, which will look like this. And so the thought is that once you clone it, the homepage, you can just like delete this, and then this becomes your like actual homepage. And then style guide is always the place that I start. And, I'm assuming if you even use client first or any others, again, this is pretty common practice anymore, is to start with a style guide, translate all those type, color, component styles over from Figma or wherever the site's been designed. Or if you just are saying screw designing and static and you just want to come into Webflow and start from here, you can do that too, right? So the other side of a style guide that I love, and although especially people that are maybe more developer mindset and come into Webflow might be like, why do you need this whole page? Why can't I just upload a CSS link or file and get running? To me, one of the benefits is that it's also a form of documentation, right? So anybody else that comes into your project later on can go through and see what's available here in type, styles, and components, colors, etc. And so you combine this, which becomes this like project specific documentation, if you will, and you combine that on top of like the high level docs like we have over here. It becomes, a helpful tool when translating, what the framework is and how the site's built to other people you work with, clients or otherwise, right? So first thing I usually do coming in here is adjust the page wrapper. I'm really just hijacking this as a really fast way to, adjust light or dark mode. So by default, the whole project is dark mode, but you can just swap background color and text color here. And then we right away have light, which is maybe more common, but like dark is cool, right? So why not start with dark? And then I just go section by section, really. So typography, whatever the custom fonts are, go ahead and upload those in project settings and then adjust them here. You can, everything that is built layout wise in the style guide is using the same layout system that you'll otherwise use to build all other pages. So, we have these columns and rows. I'll get to that in a sec, because that's, I think, probably the part that we get the most questions about on just how to use that and why it's beneficial, etc. So I'll get to that in a sec. And then type sizes, as I mentioned, you have 4 by default. If you want all 6, especially like if the design calls for it, you can totally do that. Again, just copy and paste. We're using, a margin utility here to just space these out. So I could just, whoa, I don't know what just happened. Okay, yeah, so I could just space these out, rename. Okay, now we have 5 here, and then we're going to have H5, etc. Maybe I even duplicate this. And then the other point here with headings is that we always want to have both the element itself. So all H1 headings has styling, and then we want a class that matches that identically all the way down through responsiveness. And so the point of this, and again, most frameworks already do this. We just choose to like explicitly name it H1 for an H1 versus like heading large or something like that. But if you aren't familiar, the point of doing this is that you can separate, an HTML element's purpose and meaning. So in this case, an H1 element from its visual size and style. So of course, by default, if I add an H1 to a page, I want it to look, consistent throughout the site. But there might be use cases where like, I have an H2 somewhere, but I want it to visually look like an H1. So from an accessibility and semantic HTML perspective, it needs to be the H2 like this, but I want it to visually be the size of an H1. So doing the 2 separate approaches makes them very interchangeable. And again, you're able to work very quickly that way, right? Base, like larger paragraph sizes are also pretty common, larger or smaller. Again, this is one of those things where you do this to match whatever the project is you're building. And so, this might become, I don't know, 1.6 or 1.7, right? By default, and then you could just simply change this to 1.7. And in general, while I'm on this note too, Mast does say that all classes should be lowercase and then uses dash and hyphens. Again, very similar to client first. And this is the one exception where, we say it's okay to use something like a decimal point. because in general, we want to use the lowercase hyphens and dashes so that the classes that are named in Webflow look identical to the HTML that's rendered by Webflow on the live project. And then, the thing here was like Max and I went back and forth and like, do we do this or not? So it's just balancing like legibility of things in the designer with the ultimate end result. And at the end of the day too, it's this theory of, every rule is meant to be broken in some small ways. And so, yeah, it's the balance of the limitations of what we can do with CSS, and its requirements of naming, and then how things are handled in Webflow, right? So, and then going through to card, or color, we have, a bunch of base colors here, but again, you can separate them by background and text and accent, however you want, by copy and pasting. And then we strategically like create these cards so that we have background color utilities and text color utilities that are set right here within the card. And then it's just, we have some other wrapping classes here, again, to make it presentable for documentation's sake in the style guide. So you would just come in here, modify these, again, copy, paste, duplicate as you need to. You'll notice that utilities are all prefixed with U dash, right, to mean utility. And then, any other classes like section or something that doesn't have a prefix of some kind is either what's referred to as a base class or maybe a custom class, right? And so if you check out the docs, we talk about those different class types there. And like how you use them, if they can have combo classes or not, and then even provide like examples of what those are right here in the docs. So text color, same kind of thing. We're using uText primary here, or uText mid-gray, naming as makes sense for you. Base components, every site needs buttons, and maybe different variants of primary, secondary, text only, that kind of thing. Form styles, this is another opinionated thing in terms of like the forms are pre-styled, or the inputs are pre-styled to have this kind of like somewhat different style of like having the overlaid label. And I just personally think it's a cleaner look. So I use it for a lot of projects that are open to that. But again, if you have a project that uses a more traditional style, the whole point of cloning the style guide is you can modify it when you're ready to go ahead and make use of that for your project. So for example, if we wanted our input labels to be more basic, maybe I would just like go ahead and start unsetting some of these things. Like we don't need absolute position on the input. And we want some normal padding on it, right? Like that. And I don't know, maybe a little lower height, 52. And right, so you can very quickly modify these things. Now we have like pretty regular input label relationship styling, right? So yeah. Cards is the only other really like component. Again, I feel like most projects have cards. One thing too is that like the way we create cards is to separate a wrapper that uses class of card and then an inner card body. That way you can do just like is shown here, where you have maybe something above like an image that doesn't need to have padding, and then a body part that does have padding. So you make those things interchangeable. This is again pretty much a duplicate of how Bootstrap handles cards. Yeah. Prevent style cleanup. The point of this is that we have a a methodology or a mindset in here of I already forget where it is. Somewhere of like always clearing your unused classes, right? So the thought is that we want to keep our projects tidy and clean. We don't want to have what I mentioned earlier of somebody else comes in, there's 1,000 unused classes, and you're not sure what you can clear and what you can't. And so you will have times in Webflow where you're building some custom UI directly in the canvas, and then you're publishing and using some of those classes maybe in an embed or custom code, and then you really only use them there. And so you could delete the element you use in here, but then you might accidentally clear the classes and then ruin that custom code embed, right? So instead, if you come to a section like this and paste those things here, they will forever be in Webflow then, and they won't accidentally get cleared. So that's the point of that section. Lastly is utilities. So again, we have pre-built like margin and padding utilities for what we feel is kind of the most common use cases, right? So again, if you wanted to have an MB4, which stands for 4M instead of 3M, totally add it, or if you need even ones that do adjust at different media queries. You could do like a U-SM-MB-3, meaning SM as in like, mobile landscape. So it's really whatever you need for that use case. Again, the reason it starts with as minimal amount as it does is because this is what we found out of experience is really all we usually need. And then it's using them in a strategic way to make sure you don't need all those other modifiers that some of the other frameworks tend to use, right? So again, margin and padding both offered. Like, to be super honest, I mostly use margin. The reason we have padding in here too is there is two different kind of mindsets or camps around spacing in CSS. Like, and I think it's referred to as intrinsic or extrinsic, meaning that like margins, the reason sometimes people don't like margins, this gets really nerdy, but is they do collapse, right? So if you had a margin top and a margin bottom up next to each other, then if they are not in a flexbox parent, if it's just like a block parent, then they will collapse into each other, right? Whereas padding is always, I think, what is referred to as extrinsic. So they will always be actual to what they are. So, some people just prefer to use padding in that way. Alignment, overflow, again, this is kind of the minimal amount of things that we use really often. Of course, things like UD none, so display none things when you need it, quickly setting height and width. And then the helpers down here are all intended to be, they're not just like singular styles, right? Like most of these other ones up here, where do I have that hidden? Like the UW 100 is literally a singular style that's being applied, right? Or text center is just a singular style that's being applied. Whereas the helpers have multiple attributes of style to them, right? So like Z index would have both position relative and something else applied wherever I have that right here. So I have it hidden, but right. So the position relative N1 and then link cover, image cover. Those are also ways to, as they kind of sound like, have an image cover, an aspect ratio set parent, have a link cover an entire card. So you don't have a link block wrapping a card, which is not the best for accessibility. Other things like SR only, which stands for screen reader only, again, is an accessibility benefit here. So you can visually hide text, but you want it to still be read out to a screen reader. Yeah, that kind of stuff. Lastly, layout. So section container is pretty straightforward. You'll see that all throughout here. Section is a wrapper of every section that has top and bottom padding. You can layer on utilities on top of this to remove padding on the top, bottom, both, etc., as needed to make that flexible. And then container is, as it sounds, and is very common as well. This contains all of your content. And again, you could add modifiers or even combos here, right? So in our class type clarification, we say how base classes can have combos, right? So for a section or a container, maybe a container, you have like CC blog, and that would only be like 40 rem or something like that inwards, right? Or if you want to be a little more generic, you could do CC max 40, right? And so instead of it being specific to blog, now you have a utility or a combo class acting as a utility that you can use in multiple different places throughout a design, right? So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And then we get to the grid, which again, even naming wise, it's like, should it be grid, flexbox, row, call? I don't know. We went with grid because, again, Bootstrap that this is based on names it grid, although it is not using CSS grid, it is using flexbox. And candidly, like, this is also something I was unsure about for a long time until I used grid more. Like internally at Webflow, we have our own system called Boilerplate that is very, very similar to Mast in almost every regard, except for the layout system is grid-based instead of flexbox-based. And there are pros and cons. I really, after using both for now side by side for a couple of years, I'm a bread and butter flexbox guy. I don't know how else to put it. I think there's a lot more flexibility in the way you can use this, not only to set columns, but position things, align things, that kind of stuff. It tends to be pretty versatile once you kind of get the hang of it, right? So maybe we'll get into a demo of using this. Again, I feel like this is usually where people have the most questions. But if you do scroll through this in the style guide, you'll see some of the different utilities that come along with it, like adjusting alignment at the row level. All of these are setting, the column between 1 to 12 at different breakpoints, right? So desktop, tablet, mobile landscape, and mobile portrait. We can set a specific number between 1 and 12 of columns at each breakpoint, or skip them when we don't need them. And so we'll show that in just a sec. Yeah, you can also do some like reordering, removing the gutters if you want, or shrink so that just the column is whatever the width of its children are. Yeah, so is that all making sense? Good, hopefully, cool. Okay. Yeah, let's show some layout stuff. So maybe I'll come over to our homepage here and just maybe show kind of building a common system here. So one thing also to note is even page structure. So again, we have our page wrapper, you have a nav and then a main. The other thing I didn't mention is the main is usually used for like if you have a skip nav link in your navigation that will skip over the nav for people that are using keyboards only and then go straight into the main. So I usually, copy this structure. So a really simple way could be just copy and pasting this and then going ahead and deleting everything as needed. This was even a point of feedback too. People were like, could this be a pre-built component in every project? I'm like, sure. I mean, like, this is where I think it's, I do think there's absolutely an okay reality of you clone Mast once and then you modify it for how you prefer to work. And then that's what you clone going forward. So yeah, something to keep in mind. So anyways, we'd have our basic page wrapper and main. And then within here, we're going to go ahead and add a section. This is something else that comes up. People are like, do you use the actual section element or a div? Mast doesn't really care. I don't really care. The only thing I would say is you always need your sections to be an actual section. And recently, finally, natively, when you add a section, it is preset to be a section element, which is awesome. So I've always just gotten used to using a section. And so I think that's now all the more reason I'll stick with it. But again, either way is fine, right? So I'd add my section, then I'd add a div in it, give it container, right? And then maybe now we're gonna have a heading and a paragraph, etc. Your typical kind of header. Maybe I want the background to be light gray of the header or something like that. Maybe I want a button in here, right? And so you can see I'm just like adding elements, giving them utilities, etc. A couple other quick things I want to note before getting into the column system is, and apologies, some of these are like coming to me as I'm doing it and thinking about what questions people have had in the past. And so another one is headings come by default, and paragraphs and really any typography comes by default with bottom margin. This is another contentious one. And I totally see the perspective of zeroing everything out. But the mindset here and the thinking here is that in a metaphorical sense, something we had in the pre-docs that didn't make it to the final docs, maybe it should be there, is, if you think about woodworking, and anything that you want to build something, right? And be strategic about how quickly or, what are the ways you can get there as fast as possible. And, if I add a heading in a paragraph like this, technically it's faster to not then have to go add a margin utility to all the typography to adjust as expected. If it's just already there for me, it's immediately faster, right? And then the other benefit of this is if I have multiple sections, and then this one's now in H2 and this one's in H2, of course. And then at some point the client's like, hey, I want all the spacing across the site to be more between headings and anything below them. Then, I can just quickly globally go and adjust that across all of them. And I don't have to go revisit every element across the site to adjust those padding or margin utilities individually, right? Or if I had a spacing div or whatever, right? So there's global control that comes here as a benefit, right? The caveat is that global control is a balance of being able to add and remove utilities. So both have their pros and cons. And just typography is one where we feel like it's valuable to do this. And in instances where you don't want that bottom margin because you maybe have something next to it or whatever, this is where, the margin utilities come in. So I can zero anything out at any time I want just by adding on a quick utility to do so, right? So that is typography stuff. And then I think now that I say that, I didn't even say the wood analogy was carve versus glue. So, the thinking there is that with wood, cut, they say measure twice, cut once. So, you really don't have to constantly glue back pieces together if you can instead just put them together as intended and only carve away when you need. which carved meaning the MV0, then, in general, that's a better approach. So that's the thinking. Cool. So now if I wanted to create some kind of a quick layout here, 2 column is super column or common, for example, then maybe I would go ahead and add a div. Also, I am using quick find. I apologize if anybody is newer here. All that is the same thing as adding elements from the add panel that you drag in. The benefit though is that I can just quickly hit Command E or K and type div and hit enter, and I have a div. And then I can do Command return to go over to the selector and add what I want to do. So in this case, I know I want some columns. So we're going to use the layout system, right? So the layout system operates with a row class wrapper and then columns within, right? So I'll add a div with class of row, then I'll add a call or a div within that, right? So it is a child of that, and then I will give that the class of call. And then within that call, by default, it's just extended to the full width, but I could move contents within that, and then I can start manipulating, again, how many columns out of 12 I want to set this as at each breakpoint, right? So maybe we'll just do a 2-column layout, so therefore I want it to be 6 out of 12. And then I can leave it as 6 out of 12 all the way down to mobile, or whenever I do want to make a change, maybe not on tablet, that probably still looks okay, but this is getting pretty squished. So I can go ahead and tack on another utility to adjust its width in out of 12 columns on mobile landscape, right? So as I added this, if you noticed, the nomenclature here is LG and SM. And so as noted in the docs, this goes all the way down by LG being desktop. MD is tablet. So maybe I want to get more specific here and go 8 columns here. And then as I already showed, SM is maybe we'll go to 10 mobile landscape, and then call XS is mobile portrait, right? So then maybe I want to go down to 12. So you can see I can have that really granular control, and I can also don't have to go down or up at any point, right? I could start at 6 and then go call MD 12 and then call SM 6. I don't know, maybe I want to go back and forth, right? So there's a lot of granularity in the control you have over how things are adjusted going down the breakpoints. And the benefit of this is that note in my little presentation of reducing human error, because we can build fully responsive layouts like pretty quickly. And I love the peace of mind that when I'm using the layout system, I pretty much know there's not going to be any layout bugs out of the box. Like I'm just setting these classes, and all I ever do when I go section by section of building is just quickly go through, make sure it looks good, and move on to the next section, right? Like I'm not having to constantly tweak styling at every breakpoint, which leads to errors in, one styling affecting something somewhere else or whatever, right? So the other benefit here is, adding the things I showed on the row level, right? So I can adjust Flexbox alignment, align like you see here, and justify with just quick classes, right? So if I want to justify maybe to the center, I can do that, right? And so this is what one of the points that I love about Flexbox versus Grid is that doing a layout system like this in Grid and using it to do things like center stuff or set stuff between, right? So if I also had another call here, we'll call this one like call LG, 4. And just for the sake of example, let's put in a card and a card body. And then give this maybe some like BG white, so we can just see that something is here, and maybe a paragraph, I don't know. And so the other thing I maybe want to do or often do is do a justify between, right? And so I can quickly tack these on and off, and then maybe even do like a row align center. And this is one thing that is annoying natively with Webflow, is that I can only see one level down of global utilities or combos. So although I know row align center exists, it's not going to give me that preview, right? And so, that will adjust our alignment there. Probably see it more obviously if we do something like that. And then, I can continue to adjust things as I go down. So like even this example, another thing we've gotten a lot is like, well, the base gap between columns is essentially 40 pixels. It's 20 plus 20. If I remove this here, you can see I have 20 here, and right next to it, I have another 20 adding up to 40. And then those are offset with negative 20 on the left row. And so, can I adjust that? And how do you adjust that? And so the first answer is by default, you could say we always want our default gap to be 10. So I would just adjust the base row and column styling to do so. And then beyond that, using things like justify allows you to essentially create a bigger gap by just offsetting columns, right? And then adjusting them as you go down and as needed, right? And then you can see too that even responsively, since this one shifted to 12 at MD, and therefore 12 plus 4 is more than 12, it will automatically wrap, right? So yeah, hopefully this is making sense in terms of layout and how this is powerful and helpful. Yeah, any other questions so far? I know we're getting up there in time as I'm rambling.
I think you've answered the most recent one. Aaron had just asked. He struggles with it. But what are some of the considerations to keep in mind when you want to change spacing between columns and rows? Yes, I think John had one. Let me scroll back up. Make sure I didn't miss anything. John did have one. How do you decide between pixels, M, and rims? And is it easy to have a fluid, responsive design?
Thank you for saying that one too, because yes, I meant to cover that. So our thinking and belief here is that CSS has a massive variety of units for a reason. Some of its legacy pixel existed before things like M and rem ever even existed, but there's also a lot of benefit to leveraging different units. And so the first thing I would say is that Mast, compared to something like client first, is not absolute in that, client first says everything should be rem, blanket rem. And there is that benefit if you wanted to do fluid responsive, then go that route. And you honestly could, there's no reason you couldn't do that with Mast. However, just a personal preference or across building a lot of sites, I'm not personally a fan of fluid responsive. My main beef with it is accessibility. That, even when you use JavaScript workarounds like, the fluid responsive generator, that I believe that's the way it goes about it in the FinSuite extension, is that although it can accommodate and sense when, a browser default font size has been increased, the issue with it is that text will eventually scale and oftentimes get so small that it's below like that 14 pixel threshold of kind of minimum font size that you find in a lot of accessibility standards. So that's that, I'll just say. And then the other thing that we think about with how to pick a unit is its use case. So an example is things like pixels. So our card body has 24 pixels, not rems, as the padding. And the reason I think it's okay to use pixels here is if I change my browser default font size, I gotta do this font size right there. If I make this, very large, then I don't necessarily want the padding to increase with the font size like it would with rem, because then that's actually creating less space for the text to flow itself. And I just realized this is not actually showing up in Webflow. I'd have to publish, but hopefully explaining that makes sense. And so pixels in this case is fine. Like there's no reason this needs to adjust. Other things like, the base font sizes absolutely should be rem so that they do accommodate default browser font size as needed. And then as I noted with things like margin, using M has its advantage, right? And so even showing a more clear example of that is if I do MB1, then 1M is equivalent to the size of the font. So in this case, 5.5 rem, and whatever that would be in pixels, like 80 something, right? And so as I go down in breakpoints, the amount of spacing below this will stay relative to the font size. So if we get all the way down to the smallest size where it's now 2.8, this is no longer 5.5, which is massive. It'd be way too much space for what we're looking for here. Instead, it scales with the font size, which is a really common approach from a design perspective, right? We want that space to be equivalent as we go down. And so we're just, jumping on to that font size and leveraging M in this case to do so. So I don't need to add multiple utilities. I just add MD1 and it accommodates all the way down, right? Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. I mean, other units are really open-ended. Percentage is a great one for especially absolute position things and stuff like that. VW, VH, all those things are open to use. And that's where the developer first mindset comes back, that, you as the developer need to strategically think about the best units to use for your use case and apply them as such, right? So hopefully that answers that.
I think so. I think we're now into the very specific use case questions.
Let's go.
So Corey had asked, when you use UMB0, but then wrap down on mobile and want that margin bottom back, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So this is where it depends on the use case, right? Like, again, if you had that coming up common in whatever the brand is you're designing for, you could totally add a U-SM-MB-1 that you wanted to overwrite and have that come back. The other things, which maybe overlays, I see Felix asked the question about, did you add the negative bottom margin on the rows? And yes, that was actually a recent update that, like, candidly, I've gone back and forth on for years. And who finally pushed me over the ledge was Matt Evans. If anybody's familiar with Matt, was at 80/20. Matt is so awesome and has been using Mast a lot. And we were going back and forth in DMs about it. And so the point of the negative bottom margin here is to offset the default bottom margin on the call. And this also, I'm saying this because this also solves for that question of MB0, where, you know, if we had, let's just make this a little bit more typical. So like call LG6 and then call MD12. So, you know, we want this spacing on the section to be balanced as expected. And when we shift, we still want space between those columns that are now stacked, right? So that's where you're getting this bottom margin. But then without the negative margin on the row, you know, you would end up, like, I can go ahead and just remove it. Then you end up actually having more space below things than on the top. And without that negative bottom margin that candidly I've worked with for quite a while, you know, I was just often just like using the MB0 to zero out a column in one place or another. Or there was also just the mindset of like not being overly concerned with it being exact to the pixel on every section, and just using that as I needed going down, right? So that's the kind of thinking there. And, you know, I think, again, a lot of it comes back to the use case, because the other thing that I was going to unset that back. Yeah, the other thing is, like, if you do want very, very, very granular spacing of elements at each breakpoint, that's where you really, I would say, should consider a custom class as a wrapper. And then in which case you would name it and do just like you would in Client First or many other frameworks, you know, name it using dashes and hyphens to separate, you know, like phrases and words and variants, and then adjust the styling exactly as you need it going all the way down. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Let us know if that helped, Corey. And anyone else who has any questions, please drop them in the chat or raise your hand, turn your mic on and ask them. We have just a few more minutes left with Corey. Corey, I know we were blazing through things really quick, and I may have missed you mentioned it, but one of the things that I ran into and then DM'd you about was using columns and how Webflow will auto-suggest styles as you add them. But eventually, you add too many styles, and Webflow pretends like that's not already there.
Yeah,
and so you get prompted to add a class or create a class that's already in existence. So I just want to make sure we touched on that for anyone new to Mast and using this.
Thank you. Yeah, super helpful. Yeah. So the issue here is that, you know, when you add a class, then Webflow will recognize, oh, there's existing combo classes here, right? Or it will also, if I type in MB, it'll say, oh, there's some global classes here, meaning like those are initial classes. They're, you know, they don't only ever come after another one. And so, you know, it's helpful in that I could do call LG and then SM, right? And see all my SMs, or I think you can even just do SM. You don't even need the prefix, right? And it will do this at the first level, but not beyond that, right? So I could do call LG6 again here. And then, you know, once I want to do something next, then if I do call, I don't know, MD, and then I'm intending to find like 3 or something, it will say, oh, create new combo, right? Because Webflow doesn't know that association, or I mean, it knows because it works, obviously, but like it won't display that association, right? And then the other part of this that can be confusing is it will suggest existing combo classes, right? But the illusion here that is a little tricky is that, yes, these have been combined in the past, and like, in a way, this is helpful because you'll end up having common patterns where certain layouts will be reused multiple times. And so it does make it a little quicker and is helpful there. But what's elusive about this is the CSS that's actually produced is not this. It's not actually this combination of those classes. That's the whole point of the layout system, is that all of these are separated. And I think it's like 66 classes, right? And so the thinking here, even from like a, super nerdy, how much CSS are we producing on the back end, those 66 classes, you can build a massive variety of layouts for most of your site, and you'll never go over that 66 amount, right? Whereas other approaches that everything is custom and specific to the component, the more pages and the more components you build, the more classes you produce. And like, yes, CSS is processed very fast by browsers, especially modern internet connections, etc. But it's not just about performance. It's also about, again, maintainability. And so, when you get to that extent, especially when you're building like really big sites, like enterprise level, hundreds, thousands of page sites, it becomes very unwieldy. And so, keeping that as consistent and minimal as possible is super valuable. Yeah.
Awesome. One more question from John Livingston. Do you see Webflow starting to follow a system like Mast, so all future lessons, templates, etc., will be standardized?
Yeah. This is hard in terms of like, I'll say in general, no. So the high level answer here is that I think what I love about Webflow personally, and what I think Webflow will continue to do, is that it's ultimately just a set of tools for you to decide how you want to build. And what's awesome about that is it's no different than people that are coding. Like, they get to decide if they want to use React or Angular or this JavaScript library or that CSS framework. Like, it's up to you. And the browsers, Google Chrome and such, are not going to say, we only ever, let code be run out of Bootstrap first or something. Like, it is agnostic to it. And so Webflow, I think, will always remain that way. The thing that I hope we see in the future is, just like we've already started to see in some of the recent updates and quality of life stuff, is just like more tooling and existing native functionality that lets us build things like this better or more efficiently or more scalably. And so I think that would be, if anything, the way that we see it to start to go, right? And again, I can't emphasize enough why this is a valuable thing, because so many other tools, cough framer, editor X, etc., when you build a layout, they decide if you're using Flexbox or Grid or Float or whatever. You have no say in it. And sure, people that are beginners, I will again recommend Framer and such all day long. But if you really are a pro and you are eventually working with clients and clients that have engineering teams and etc., like, you having that control, and then therefore eventually understanding the differences and the benefits, just like picking an M versus a pixel, like, that is power, that is value that you can then turn into make money. I mean, like, at the end of the day, like, there is a lot of value in that level of control, right? And so to me, that's, again, a benefit. And I hope Webflow never gets overly opinionated about it. And I, at least if I'm internally and am able to have a say, which, my voice is small at the end of the day, but I will always advocate for that we stay agnostic to those things. And if anything, things like templates, I think we are looking at evolving the guidelines there. But it's honestly, it's a tricky thing, y'all, because like, I 100% empathize with the need for it to be standardized and maybe more opinionated. But the issue is that, like, if it's too opinionated, then it does start to do that, where it takes away the flexibility of template creators to, choose an approach that they think is best, especially if the design and the layout of the site calls for one way or another, right? So, yeah.
You see the questions coming in. It's the final
I do.
one.
Yeah.
And that was what I was going to ask. Mast has been in production for a long time. You used it internally. It had a private beta phase where a lot of people got to use it before you publicly made it available, and it's changed a lot along the way. So I kind of had a two-part question. One was, what's the biggest way it's changed since you first started using it? And two, where is it going once we start adding numbers to that version number?
Yeah, I think such good questions. The biggest way I think it's changed since originally using it is honestly getting lighter. When I first started using it, like, can I even find quickly, and I can also go over a bit design skills to kind of preset that for them. So that's something we talked about. I would still love to do it. Candidly, we'll see if we can get the time, because, time is always escaping between client work and all that. And then the only other thing I'll add is, like, I think I'm excited about, again, stuff that hopefully comes within Webflow in the future to make using systems even easier. And I'm hoping whatever that is, that honestly, I don't know for sure, but I'm hoping we can adjust Mast to, align with those things as they come out. So we'll always have kind of this latest and greatest version using whatever tooling exists in Webflow at that time to its advantage, right? So, yeah.
It's exciting. I have a lot of love for Mast because similar to you, I started writing by hand and then found frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation. And what I loved about those frameworks also became what I ended up disliking about them, because the longer they lived, the more bloated they got. Like, some of them, it was, we have to add everything. This framework needs to solve absolutely everything, from sticky to plugins to make, columns auto size height based on by content and all this JavaScript. And Mast has distilled the foundation of all of those original frameworks back down to a very simple, elegant way to go back to that. And
Totally.
I love how this has all worked out, and I love that you were able to come in and kind of show us all how Mast came to be and how to use it and answer all of our questions. So we really appreciate you being at Flow Party today, Corey. Thank you.
Honored to be here. Thanks y'all for coming and listening and hearing me nerd out.
Anytime. That's what we love.
Yeah.
So,
great.
Awesome. All right, we're gonna wrap this up. If any, y'all can stick around. The after party is always gonna happen, but we're gonna shut down the recording, get it processed. There were a bunch of people who couldn't make it because of last second client meetings or things came up, and we'll get that recording processed and uploaded next week for everyone. So thanks for joining Flow Party, everyone. Corey, thank you again for your time. And if you're interested in learning more about Mast, nocodesupply.co/Mast. All the docs are there, the clonables there. Have fun building.